Hello, my friends. Luiz Lima here. Once again, we do this program, Spiritism, a closer look on Kardec Radio, every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. On this program, we're going to take a closer look at the faces of violence. Violence, unfortunately, it's on the news every day. It's almost like part of our life. Shouldn't be, but we're still dealing with that. We haven't got past that yet. So I'm going to start telling you a story. This past Monday, a couple of days ago, in Brazil, some shocking news came up. An ex-professional basketball player punched his girlfriend inside the elevator in the building where they lived. So he punched her 61 times. That's 61 jabs on a woman. And the guy's an athletic body because he's a professional athlete, 29 years old. So he did a lot of damage. The woman had several fractures in her nose, jaws, the bones in the cheek, mouth, eye socket. It was really, really bad. She is recovering. She's going to be okay, but it's going to be a long shot. The whole thing, the whole ordeal was caught on the camera's elevator, and the video went viral. It's incredible how comes, things like this happen. And she says for the past 2.5 years, she has been suffering unbearable psychological violence from this same guy. So, this is just one type of violence, but violence goes way beyond physical punches. This is just, unfortunately, we have to tell it this way. It's just another news, just another day. Anyhow, so violence is much more than punches. When we mention the word violence, when we speak of violence, for most people, what comes to mind for most people? What comes to mind at the sound of the word violence, things are usually come to mind are wars, physical aggression, like this one that I just mentioned to you, domestic abuse, things like this. It's the first thing that for most people, for the great majority of the people, that what comes up to mind. Now, violence has forms and nuances that put its concept in a much broader realm of possibilities that we can initially think or even consider. So violence is huge. It aggregates a lot of things. So we're going to talk about these things and then bring the Spiritist view on the subject of violence. To talk about violence, the first thing is to define what violence is. So we are all on the same page. For some people who are violent by nature, they don't think they are, meaning their concept of violence is not the same as someone who is not violent. So a popular definition of violence, and this is, by the way, from the Webster Dictionary, it's the use of physical force so as to injure, abuse, damage, or destroy. So this definition is centered around physical force. Another popular definition would be something like this: intentional infliction of harm upon individuals or groups where such harm undermines their autonomy, dignity, or capacity for flourishing. It's a broader definition, but still, it brings the idea of something physical. Now, what would be a Spiritist definition? It's a lot more comprehensive than just what we said here. In Spiritism, or for Spiritism, violence is any action, thought, or intention. So this is already much more than the other definitions. So violence is any thought, action, thought, or intention that disregards the moral laws, the laws established by God, especially those concerning love, justice, and respect for free will. As a consequence, it impedes the spiritual progress of people and incarnate spirits. So you see, the Spiritist definition is a lot broader, a lot more comprehensive than the standard definition. A thought, depending on the thought, could be a form of violence. Simply the intention, even if the action doesn't materialize, just the intention of doing harm is a form of violence, because Spiritism doesn't look at the manifest cruelty. Spiritism looks at the intelligent principle, the spirit. That's why there's a difference in these definitions. Now, from whatever point of view you define violence, one thing needs to be considered. Violence is always intentional. Always intentional. So, as you can see, the popular definitions are centered on the manifested cruelty, and the Spiritist view is centered on the intelligent principle, the spirit. So, if the criteria is different, the outcome must be different. So, the outcome for society might not be the same outcome as from the Spiritist point of view. And that's what we are going to take a look at. In order to study violence, we usually divide violence in its four main forms, which are, we're going to go in details through each one. I'm just going to tell you what they are: physical, psychological, structural, and symbolic. Well, let's talk about each one of them. Starting with physical violence. Well, physical violence, the name says, it's a physical attack that causes bodily harm, and that engenders some sort of physical contact. In this case, physical violence, both victim and perpetrators are easily identified, like the case that I told you. The man and the woman fighting and all of that. We know exactly who the victim is and who the perpetrator is. Examples of physical violence: war, assault, torture, rape, murder, domestic abuse, suicide. Now, physical violence has high visibility, meaning people look and see. High visibility. And it's also criminalized. All these forms of physical violence, they're criminalized. So we are not supposed to do them, to practice any of those. That's physical violence. There's also a second level, which is psychological violence, sometimes also called emotional violence. Well, what is this? This is a different type of harm. It's not physical. It's emotional or mental harm on someone. In cases like this, the victim is identifiable, but the perpetrator is not necessarily. Because it's not that easy. Examples: cyberbullying. So the victim is easily identifiable, but the perpetrator not necessarily. Other types: false accusations, manipulation, humiliation. Those are forms of psychological violence. In terms of visibility, it's still high visibility because people see what's happening to the victim. It has less visibility than the physical violence, but still it's something. Visibility is clear. It's there. It is often criminalized. However, in order for this to take place properly, you have to be able to identify the perpetrator, and that's not necessarily a simple task. That's psychological violence. Third type, structural violence. Structural violence. Well, this has to do with a type of violence that prevent people, and people meaning incarnate spirits, from meeting their basic needs. The victim of structural violence is not one person, but it's a group, it's a society. It could be a whole city, a whole country, a whole whatever county. So the victim is identifiable, but it's not one person, it's a group. It's a group of people. Now, the perpetrator is not clear because it's something built into the system. Examples of structural violence is anything or any sort of harm that is caused by unjust systems. For example, racism, poverty, inequality, sexism, segregation, marginalization. Those are all types of structural violence. It brings low visibility. It's something somewhat subtle and is not criminalized. Let's go for the fourth type, symbolic violence. Symbolic meaning it touches people's symbols. What is this? Well, the definition tells us what it is. Symbolic violence is related to the imposition of cultural and religious or religious values with the purpose of creating inequality and domination. So the purpose is very, very, very clear for those who practice symbolic violence. So it's imposition of cultural and religious values on other people to create inequality or segregation and domination. The victims are not one person, but groups. So usually a large group of people or society, whatever it is. Examples of symbolic violence. Change of belief systems. For example, or the perpetrators per se, will impose their belief system on groups of people. Education, they will replace the education system with theirs. They will replace the norms, the language, the traditions. They bring this idea of superiority narrative. What they say is what it is. That's symbolic violence. Because you're interfering in other people's lives negatively. Symbolic violence has very low visibility. It's very subtle. And it's not criminalized because it's not something tangible, feasible that we can look and see. No. Now, we spoke about these 4 levels of intellectuality, these levels of violence. So the level of intellectuality is higher towards symbolic. We started down here with physical, went to psychological, went to structural, went to symbolic. As you go up on this scale, you need to have higher intellectuality. Because to be able to produce some sort of symbolic, which is the top one, violence, you need coordinated action, strategies, how you're going to make it happen. You need to create elements of control. So everything has to be in place before you're able to actually make it happen, symbolic violence. So there's intellectuality required as we go towards symbolic. Also because symbolic is collective. So it's more difficult to dominate several people, a group of people, large groups of people, instead of one person. Now, all of this that we said so far is just to say the violence is here. It's every day. It's part of our life. Now, over to Spiritism. What does Spiritism tell us? How should we see it? What should we do? So first, violence in the Spiritist framework is not based on visibility. Remember, we spoke about visibility for each one of them. Violence in the Spiritism framework is not based on visibility. It's based on how spiritual evolution is hindered, how spiritual evolution is made difficult, how it is delayed by that form of violence. So the focus is different. And remember, Spiritism and the Spiritist framework include reincarnation. We can never forget that. And that changes everything. That's a game changer. Because now we can go back in time, meaning going back and analyzing previous lives of people in general. You don't have to know what happened in your past life exactly. We just need to know that we have several lives, and we bring history with us. We are here today because of the way we are, because of our spiritual history. So we can go back and start looking at these violent tendencies, where they stem from. So it could be, for example, a past life trauma created by power abuse, for example, in a past life or several lives ago. That will create the need in that spirit that suffered the violence, that, this is creating a trauma. At one point, this is going to erode, and, it's going to be part of their life somewhere along the lines. It could also be a self-trap into these cycles of hatred or revenge, that the person, the hatred comes up in a certain life, it becomes more intense, it becomes a snowball, and because of that, you don't do things right, and because you don't do things right, your hatred increases, and you keep looping around. Self-trap. So now you're here, and you have all this hatred accumulated in your soul, in your chest, like we say, right? And that's going to be discharged somehow. And that's why we see horrible things, just like the story I told you in the beginning, which is, by the way, a horrible story. Although it's one person, it's two people, one perpetrator, one victim. It's worse when it's collective, but it's a horrible story. Another reason that, another thing that violence tendencies could stem from, karmic relationships. Karmic relationships where the roles of victim and aggressor alternate. So in this life, you're victim and the other person is aggressor. On the previous life, you was the other way around. In the previous life, it was the other way around again, and keep, switching back and forth, switching roles back and forth, just swapping roles back and forth. And here we are. Violence could stem from it, because the cycle is never broken. Now, in terms of spirit, what we were talking about maybe causes for in past lives. Now, if we look at the spirit itself, the intelligent principle, any form of violence comes because we disregard the law of love. It could be fear, it could be insecurity or cowardice. It could be struggle for power. All of these things. Now, ultimately, all of these things still have one and the same root: pride and selfishness. That's very clear in the Spirit's book. Pride and selfishness are the greatest obstacles to progress, moral progress. And selfishness is the cause of all vices. Also very clearly stated in the Gospel according to Spiritism. So violence, in short, it comes from spiritual ignorance. Spiritual ignorance. Spiritual immaturity. So if it has to do with the spiritual maturity, then it becomes a little more interesting. And I'm going to put this here, that we use this a lot of times. That's the spirit scale. Towards the bottom, the shades of red are spirits that are less advanced or low order spirits. As you go up, they are higher order spirits, the green ones, and the blue ones are pure spirits. With this image on the screen, we're going to say a few things. We saw that violence reflects spiritual immaturity. Maturity comes from the bottom of the scale to the top. Very immature in the bottom, it goes on to mature. That said, violence is incompatible with spiritual evolution. It's either or. Either you are growing spiritually, or you are stuck in the level of violence, which is, more violent. It means further down on the scale. Violence belongs in the early stages of moral development. Very important. Violence belongs in the early stages of moral development. Low order spirits think that violence will make them strong and better. Not at all. For these low order spirits, violence is automated in their perispirit. They just do it because it's habit. When violence is not at all a sign of strength and a better person. It's a sign of weakness. So low order spirits tend to be more violent collectively. Let me see if I can explain that to you. If I am, or somebody who is very low on the scale, let's say impure, barely frivolous, for example. And that person, for some reason, thinks that it's being attacked. That person thinks it's being attacked by one person. What they do is they don't react towards that one person and, for example, kill that one person. They kill that one person and their entire family. Collective violence. The lower in the scale, the more likely that they will be performing collective violence. Collective violence exists in all four levels. Remember, physical, psychological, structural, and symbolic. For example, at the physical level, physical violence, mass shootings. That's collective. By the way, this year, 2025, we are in the month of July, end of July, so roughly half a year. And so far in the United States, we have had 254 mass shootings. Another form of psychological violence. Manipulations of masses, for example, it's collective. Gaslighting. And structural and symbolic violences are collective by default. That's by default. That has to do with dominance of people and groups of people and societies and so forth. Now, collective violence everything that we do in this life, we are responsible for, we're going to have to offset everything. Collective violence will have us pay even a higher price. So if you consider, for example, cycles of violence, how do we break these cycles of violence? How do we get out of the snowball of being violent life after life after life? How do we break the cycle? Einstein has a very interesting phrase. Very interesting phrase. He says, we cannot solve a problem with the same thinking we used when we created the problem. The solution will not come from the same level that created the problem. It has to come from at least one level above. Same here. Violence is not going to be a solution for violence. We cannot break a cycle of violence using violence. We just make it a greater snowball. Spiritism is one level above, is what's going to teach us moral transformation, not punishment. It's going to teach us that the outer world is a reflection of the inner world. It's going to teach us that we need to grow in responsibility. We need to grow in wisdom. We need to grow in compassion. It will teach us to seek inner peace. How? Prayer, meditation, spiritual treatments, study, knowledge, practice of forgiveness. Forgiveness is what breaks the cycle, actually. Because if you forgive somebody for what they did in the past, you immediately avoid the alternation of roles. Immediately. So you break the cycle. Another thing that we can do to obtain or achieve inner peace, serving other people. Serving other people dissolves selfishness, which is at the root of everything. So these are things that we can do. I like a phrase that I heard many, many years ago, but I just think it's fantastic. It's from South African Bishop Desmond Tutu. He's no longer with us here, but he had a phrase fantastic. If you're in the middle of an argument, we all have the tendency to become violent at one point, not necessarily to kill the other person, but to become more, raise our voices and so, and point fingers. And most of us do that or have that tendency. What it says is, don't raise your voice. Improve your arguments. What does it mean, improve your arguments? Have more knowledge to react and participate in the situation with no violence, with arguments. Violence is not an argument. So Spiritism gives us the tool to gather enough knowledge to create the conditions that make violence possible. If we do not create situations or conditions that make violence possible, that's already great. Because violence is undesirable from all points of view. Now, to wrap up something that we said in the beginning, violence is always intentional. Violence is always by design of those who practice violence. And the designer is always the intelligent principle. Always. It's not God. God never wanted us to practice any sort of violence. And remember, in Spiritism, definition of violence: action, thought, and intention. all three of them, or any of them, if you will. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight about this, the faces of violence. I hope you like it, and we'll be here next Wednesday at 7 p.m. right here on Kardec Radio.